In this video, I'm going to talk about the case analysis framework that I expect you to use for financial reporting cases. Remember that copyright laws apply to both the PowerPoint from McGraw-Hill Education and the audio, which is from me. In this video, I'm going to cover Learning Objective 5 from Chapter 1, Appendix 1A, which is to apply the case analysis framework to solve accounting and reporting issues. This is really a generic framework for case analysis that's given in the textbook, but I'm going to tweak it just a little. The textbook has 6 steps, but I'm going to add some additional items. So let's go through the adjusted case analysis approach. First, you need to read the narrative, and while reading it, create your case plan, or at least start on your case plan. If you're a really quick reader, you can read the narrative first and then reread it and start working on your case plan. But if you're like me, a slow reader, you really need to create your plan while you're reading the narrative. Remember to read critically. And that means that you're reading each sentence and critically evaluating the information to determine if you need it in your case plan or if it's just something that's, keep in the back of your head, but I don't want to write it down on my case plan. Find your role and place it in your case plan. Be sure to note if you're internal, an employee of the corporation, or external, such as a consultant or an auditor. You need this information so that your communication to the client is appropriate. For instance, if you're internal, then it's appropriate to write, "We need to do this," or "We should definitely do that." So the word "we" should show up in your submission to the client. But if your role is external, then you shouldn't be writing "we." We should, or you should say, "Your company needs to," or "You should definitely need to." So your communication is only appropriate if you truly understand your role and whether it's internal or external. Then you need to note down any requireds. So what does that mean? Sometimes there are umbrella requirements in the narrative. This might be something like analyze the financial reporting issues that you find in the appendices. This is a required because there may be multiple financial reporting issues under that one required. Another example of a required could be develop the audit planning memo if we were doing an audit case. There are multiple issues here because you would have to complete the risk of material misstatement assessment. You'd have to do the audit approach. You'd have to calculate materiality, and you'd have to provide the procedures. So notice that that required of developing an audit planning memo has multiple issues underneath it. So keep in mind that the requireds are generally umbrella requireds, which may have multiple issues which will be expanded upon in the appendices or the exhibits in the case. Continuing with your case plan, you need to identify the users, the entities which will be directly impacted by your recommendations in the case. You need to be sure you identify the key users. So let's give an example. It might be true that for a corporation, the users could be things like the employees and the customers and society at large and the creditor and the potential shareholders and the actual shareholders and the possible, venture capitalist who wants to invest in your business. Like I could go on. But if these entities are not listed in the case or they're not directly impacted by your recommendation, then you should not put them on your list of key users. Remember that users are looking to you for your expertise in financial reporting. And keep in mind that for each user, you need to list their goals or their long-term objective. I'm not talking about listing the requireds here. So I'm not saying, the client has asked you to produce the financial statements. That's not the client's goal. That's just a required to help them achieve their goal. So let's say the client's goal is to expand into the US. So that is their long-term goal. That's what I want you to write down because that is driving all their actions. So, another example would be the goal of creditors is generally always to receive interest payments and repayment of the debt in the future. Now, true that the creditor may ask you for audited financial statements, but that's not their goal. That's a way of reaching their goal. So you need to list the long-term goals of each user because that will help you to determine how your recommendations will impact their future. So be sure to list all the key users and their goals with regards to the organization. Again, continuing with the planning, provide the constraints. Is the organization following IFRS or ASPE? Are there any bank covenants? List them and provide details. Don't just say debt to equity ratio. Actually give the maximum debt to equity ratio that the bank requires. Are there shareholders agreements, some kind of contract? Anything that might impact your ability to advise your client must be listed here. And key will be the standard that you have to use when you're analyzing financial reporting issues. Remember, it's critical you use the correct standards, and you can only do that if you have a clear statement with regards to which of the standards you're going to use. In addition, provide a timeline. It doesn't have to be super detailed. It could be just what's today's date, when do you have to report to the client, and what is the period end date. This is going to help you to determine, for instance, if you're in the subsequent event period or if you have to do a prior period adjustment. The timeline should be bare minimum, but you need at least the date for today, the date you've got to respond to the client, and the period end reporting date. Generally, you find the issues in the appendices and the exhibits. So in order to be able to identify the issues for your case plan, you need to read the appendices/exhibits now. While you're reading them, identify all of the issues and add them to your case plan. Provide enough details so that you can do a good job allocating your time afterwards. If you just list a title for the issue, like revenue recognition, you won't have enough information to determine how much time to allocate to each issue. So it's best to at least provide summary information, maybe the total dollar value, how the client recorded it. You could even put down a question like, when should we recognize revenue? I do know this slide says to rank the issues, but quite honestly, in a case test, you have to analyze all of the issues. So ranking the issues is less important than it might otherwise be. So I wouldn't spend a huge amount of time on ranking the issues. Instead, spend more time ensuring that you have enough information to allocate your time appropriately and make sure you do just that. Allocate your remaining time between all the issues in your case plan. Now, in your case plan, you might want to also identify any viable alternatives for each issue. This is a good idea because it's kind of like an outline for an essay. It'll guide your writing as you produce the memo or report to the client. So let's give an example. If you're considering how to report long-lived assets under IFRS, you can note that you could either use the cost model or the revaluation model in order to report the long-lived assets. If you're under ASPE, let's say the issue is the interest on self-constructed asset. You could indicate that there are viable alternatives under ASPE. You can either capitalize it as part of the cost of the self-constructed asset, or you can expense it as incurred. So putting down the alternatives will help you when you're producing your submission to the client. Note that sometimes there are no alternatives. For instance, under IFRS, corporations must use the deferred tax method. It's a done deal. There's no viable alternatives. And do not put down an alternative that goes against the standards that you've already identified. You just can't put down a non-viable alternative. It's not viable to go against the standards, so don't waste your time writing that alternative down. Remember that these alternatives would be under each issue's heading. So it's part of your case plan with regards to the issue and the details you want to know in order to allocate your time. Now is when your case plan is finished and you need to start writing your submission to the client. For each issue, be sure to analyze each viable alternative. This may include quantitative, number crunching, or qualitative, an analysis of the pros and cons of each alternative, or both. The analysis has to start by providing the appropriate standard and then applying the case facts against the standard to see if it is met or not met. This analysis must be concise. It's got to be logically structured. Otherwise, it's so confusing to the marker or the client who's reading your submission. Remember that you're communicating with the client, so be sure you're addressing your client appropriately, right? If you're internal, you're going to say, we should do this and we should do that. If you're external, you're going to say, you should do this and you should do that. It's also got to be at the appropriate level of detail given their background in financial reporting. If they know nothing about financial reporting, using jargon and short forms, that's not going to be acceptable. Finally, make sure if there are viable alternatives that you address the impact of each alternative on the user's goals. Always circle back to the key users because they're the individuals who will be impacted by your recommendations. For each issue, be sure to provide a final recommendation/conclusion. And also, you need to show the impact of your recommendation on the key financial metrics that the client cares about. For example, if the client is concerned about, let's say, earnings per share, then you have to analyze the impact of your recommendation on that metric, earnings per share. Again, key is to be clear, concise, and always answer all the requirements that the client asked. So that's it for the approach to a case. But let's quickly look at two templates that I recommend you use when answering financial reporting cases. Note that there's a link to both of these documents in the description below the video. So I'm just going to pull them up. So this is the case planning template for financial reporting. You'll notice that you start by listing your role and indicating if it's internal or external. Remember, that ties into your ability to communicate appropriately with the client. Then you list the users and their strategic objectives or their long-term needs or their goals, and remember, primary users only. And you need their goals because their goals drive what they are going to do in the future. And therefore, you need to be able to tell them, hey, my recommendation is going to do good for your long-term goals, or it's going to suck towards your long-term goals. And be specific. What do they want? I always tell my students, what is the wish of their heart? Long-term, what do they want out of this company? And a lot of students simply put down they want a profit, but that's not what every single user wants. So look in the case to see if there's something specific. If there's not, it's acceptable to put down the owner of the company wants to be profitable. That's fine if there's no other indicator in the case. Now, next, you're going to list the constraints. Remember, you need to know whether it's IFRS or ASPE. Any bank covenants, be specific, any other constraints. And then you've got the timeline, minimum. What's today's date? What's the date you have to report to the client? And what is your reporting period end, right? And then you've got the requireds, those umbrella requireds that are in the narrative, usually in the last two paragraphs. And then the issues. And list the appropriate issues under the requireds. And if there's no requireds, then you can just list all the issues. Be sure to list a title, descriptive but short, right? So something like revenue recognition or inventory valuation. Then you want some kind of description, dollar value details. This is the details that you think are critical when you're going to write your submission to the client. Then where is it located on the case? I know I didn't mention this previously, but let's say I have a 5-page case. I really need to know where this information is because I don't want to be flipping through 5 pages trying to find it. So I like to note quickly that this is on page 3, paragraph 6, or it's in Appendix 2. And it's at the second half of the page. Then your time allocation, because you need to know how much time you're going to spend analyzing this issue and writing up the submission to the client, and then rank the issues if it's required. Like I said, often it's not required because the expectation is you will address every single issue. So ranking them really doesn't make a difference, but sometimes you have to rank them because one issue will impact the calculation in another issue. So, for instance, if I ask you to talk about inventory valuation, and then I also ask you for the total impact on the debt to equity ratio, you're going to have to do the analysis of the inventory write down before you try and tell me what the impact is on the debt to equity ratio. So sometimes ranking is important because you need to do one issue before you do another one. Otherwise, the second issue won't be calculated appropriately. So that's the end for the case planning template. Now, let's look at a template to respond to the client. So this is the template I want you to use when you're responding to the client. So I'm not saying if you have a memo, you should have a to, from, subject, date. You should also have a little paragraph introduction. So I'm not saying that should be missed. But once it gets to the issues, the structure of your response should always be the same. So you're going to start with the title for the issue. And please don't just use issue 1, issue 2. That is unbelievably irritating. By the time I get to the bottom of your response, I don't know what issue 1 is anymore. So make the title short but descriptive. So inventory valuation, or valuation of property, plant, and equipment, or write down of property, plant, and equipment, or revenue recognition, some descriptive title. And it should be short. If it's more than 5 words, it's probably too long. Then I want you to use the heading, assess the situation. So this is where you give me a short reiteration of the case facts. And when I say case facts, copy from the case. It's the issue, the summary of the issue that you think you have to analyze. It should be 1 to 3 sentences maximum, or you can use bullet points. And you might want to include a question that focuses on what's required. So a good example would be, when should revenue be recognized? Or an example might be, how should we value the inventory? Or how should we value the property, plant, and equipment? Or how should we value this investment in equity shares? So it's a good idea because it helps focus your attention. Then you've got the heading, standards and analysis, and you're going to use that heading, and you should use that heading because it allows the client to know what you're talking about, but it also allows a marker to know what you're talking about. So provide the standard. It can be a copy from the handbook, or you can paraphrase it. You want to include the standard, the section, and the paragraph. It not only if you're copying, but if you're paraphrasing, right? And this is providing the standard is so critical because it guides your analysis. And then what you want to do is analyze the standard using case facts. So let's say I have the standard, it's step 1, IFRS revenue recognition, identify the contract. Then I'm going to use the case facts to show that I am identifying the contract and there is a identifiable contract. And so I'm going to use case facts against that standard, identify the contract, to show that there is a contract and there is commercial substance. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about. You've got the standard, and then you have the case fact against the standard, which shows that either they are following the standard or they're not following the standard. So that's why often I say use met or not met, because let's say we do that step 1, identify the contract, and then I use the case fact and I realize there is no contract. So I'm going to say not met. Step 1 is not met because there's no identifiable contract. So analyze the standard using case facts from the case. If you don't do that step, you're going to lose the majority of your marks. Explain why it is met or not met using the case facts. Then at the bottom, after you've done the full standard and analysis, you're going to make a recommendation, conclude and advise. There's no need to reiterate your analysis, but the recommendation should flow from your analysis and be consistent with it. I mean, if you've done an analysis and then you're going to tell me in the recommendation something that's direct opposite of what you analyzed, that's problematic. You always have to have a recommendation or a conclusion. Do not say to your client, oh, you could do it either way. Let's say there's 2 alternatives. You can capitalize the interest or you can expense it under ASPE. And so you've got both of those options and you do an analysis to show what's the impact on the financial statements or the critical ratios. You can't now say to the client, oh, by the way, you could do whichever one you want because both of them are allowed under ASPE. No. You go back to the client's goals and you see which option is best for their goals and you make a solid and firm recommendation. Then provide the journal entry or the correcting entry. Sometimes this is not required, but even when it's not required, it's really helpful to determine the journal entry or the correcting entry because it'll help you analyze the impact on the key matrix for the user. Be careful that you understand when you need to provide a journal entry, the original transaction, because the client hasn't made any entry at all, versus a correcting entry where the client has made an entry, the entry is incorrect, and you have to fix it. So keep in mind, sometimes it's a journal entry that you need, sometimes it's a correcting entry. And then finally, provide the impact on the client's goals or the constraints that came from your case plan. Really, if you're not providing the impact on the key matrix in the case, then you are missing part of the important analysis that you're giving your client, the value added that you're giving your client. So an example would be, let's say you recommend a write down of inventory and the client's worried about their current ratio. Then we need to indicate that this write down is going to reduce current assets. There's going to be no change to current liabilities, so your ratio will worsen. And please don't use the word increase or decrease. Sometimes students will say it increases the ratio or it decreases the ratio. That does not tell me that you understand whether this ratio is getting worse or better. You're telling me the math behind it. I don't want to know the math. I want to know your understanding on whether the client is going to be happy or they're going to be sad. So keep in mind that last part. And then what you're going to do is you're going to go back up to the top and you're going to start this whole process over again for the next issue. So again, both of these templates are in the description below the video if you'd like to use them. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I hope it was helpful.